And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing. You know, suddenly we've got lives and I've got children, and you know, the effort that we put in, because we work really hard. So I was sitting at home not too long ago, just sitting, you know, and someone asked me a question I'd never really stopped to think about. They said, who are the 5 people you've loved the most? And I smiled for a second, because that's a much easier question than asking who was the greatest, or what was your biggest hit. People usually want to know about the Beatles, about the records, about the fame, and I understand that, but that's not what comes to mind anymore. The funny thing about getting older is that you stop counting achievements and you start counting faces. So I gave that question some thought. 5 names came into my head almost immediately. The first person I thought about was Joe Walsh. The first name that came into my mind was Joe Walsh. Now people think they know Joe, the wild man, the guitar hero, the guy who wrote that song about how his life's been good to him so far, which is a very funny song, except it wasn't entirely a joke. Joe went through hell. The drinking, the cocaine, the decades lost. He should have died a dozen times. And then he got sober. And he's stayed sober. But that's not why I love him. Joe is one of the gentlest souls I've ever met. He's actually very shy. All that wildness on stage, that's him working through it. We speak the same language, Joe and me, the language of men who woke up one day and realized they'd destroyed themselves and didn't know how to stop, and then found the impossible courage to stop anyway. We don't have to explain anything to each other. He gets it. I remember when we properly became friends. I'd just gotten sober with Barbara. I was raw, shaky, hanging on by my fingernails, and Joe, who was still drinking then, would show up at my house unannounced and just sit with me for hours. On one particularly bad night, he looked at me and said, "You're doing the hardest thing anyone can do. Don't stop." He was still struggling himself, but he set aside his own pain to sit with me in mine. I've never forgotten that. He still says the same thing every time we see each other. He puts both hands on my shoulders, looks me right in the eye and says, "We're still here." 3 words that mean more than any long speech ever could. I remember one night at his house in LA, both of us sober by then. We were sitting in his music room, the California light turning gold through the windows. Joe picked up a guitar and started playing something slow, just a progression of chords, melancholy and searching. After a while he stopped and said, very quietly, "I wasted so many years I can't get back." And I didn't offer platitudes. I just said, "Yeah, me too." Then after a pause, "But we're here now. That's something." He nodded and started playing again. The same chords, but this time it sounded less like mourning, more like acceptance. And then there was the tour, where I started sneaking up behind his amplifier during Life's Been Good and making exaggerated complaining faces at the exact moment he sang, "I can't complain, but sometimes I still do." It became a nightly game. By the final show, he'd rigged a little mirror on his mic stand to catch me, and when he finally did, he laughed so hard he nearly missed the next verse. After the show, I found a note taped to my door. "You win this round, Starkey. Agent Walsh." It's still one of my favorite souvenirs. Not because it was important, because it was so gloriously unimportant. When I think about Joe, I think about the sound of a guitar being tuned in a quiet room, not played, just tuned, the soft, searching notes. And I think about his honesty. He'll tell you the truth even when it makes him look bad. In our world, that's about the rarest quality there is. The next person I want to talk about is George Martin. Everyone knows he was the 5th Beatle, the gentleman producer in the control room at Abbey Road who took our wild ideas and turned them into something real. The string quartet on Yesterday, the orchestral climax of A Day in the Life. He was the grown-up in a room full of brilliant children maintaining order while enabling chaos. But that's not why I loved him. I loved him because he was one of the few adults in my young life who treated me with unwavering respect. George Martin looked at me and saw a musician, not a drummer, not the replacement for Pete Best. Not the lucky one, a musician. Do you know what that means to a kid from the Dingle who left school at 13 and spent years in hospitals? He saw me. I remember during the recording of Please Please Me, he came into the studio, sat beside the drum kit and said, "I was wrong about you. You've got something." It's not technical, it's something else. I was 22, desperately insecure about my place in the band, and those words landed with the force of a benediction. He wasn't being kind. He was stating a fact he'd come to recognize. During the Sgt. Pepper sessions, the recording days stretched on forever. There were long stretches where I had nothing to do while the others worked out harmonies. George Martin would come out of the control room and sit with me. He'd bring a cup of tea and we'd talk about nothing. Gardening, cricket. He knew I was bored and felt left out. He had 100 things to do, but he did that. And when I quit the band in 1968 during the White Album sessions, convinced I was the least important Beatle, when I came back 2 weeks later, George Martin was the first person I saw at Abbey Road. He simply said, "Welcome home, Richard." 4 guys, we had rows, it never got in the way of the music, no matter how bad the row was. 4 guys, we had rows, it never got in the way of the music, no matter how bad the row was. "I have something I want you to hear." He played me this beautiful track and said, "This is for you. John wrote it for you. I've done the arrangement." He'd pulled together this whole reunion, John on piano, George Harrison on guitar, me on drums, just to get me back in the studio. He knew I needed to make music. He didn't make a speech, he just handed me the headphones. And there was a night during the Abbey Road sessions we were recording Because. Tense times. The band was falling apart. Martin was directing with his usual precision, and I started making exaggerated, serious listener faces behind his back. Paul saw it and cracked. Then John. Then George. Within 30 seconds, all 4 of us were laughing helplessly, and George Martin turned around with this expression of complete bewilderment and said, "What is so amusing?" which made us laugh even harder, and then his own composure cracked. The dignified producer sat down and laughed until tears ran down his face. That's what I'll miss. Not the records. Watching George Martin lose it in the control room because we were being idiots. He died peacefully at home. He was 90. I was on tour when I got the call. I sat in my hotel room and looked out the window for a long time. What I miss most is his voice, that beautiful, calm, certain voice, and the smell of tea brewing in a studio control room. Earl Grey, warm vacuum tubes. It's the smell of safety, the smell of George. The next person who came into my mind was Barbara, my Barbara. The world knows her as a Bond girl. Anya Amasova in The Spy Who Loved Me. The beautiful blonde with the striking blue eyes. And she was stunning. Still is. But that's not why she's on this list. She's on this list because she saved my life. I was going to die and she was going to die, and we looked at each other and said, "Not like this." I could not have done it without her. We met on the set of Caveman in 1980. I was in a fur loincloth, covered in fake dirt. She was standing near the craft services table, holding a cup of coffee. The sun was behind her. She looked up, caught me staring, and smiled. I was gone, right there, in a fur loincloth, gone. But what I remember most is her laugh. Someone made a joke, and she laughed this full, unguarded laugh. In a business full of fake laughs, she was real. We fell hard and fast, and then we fell into a madness together, the cocaine, the alcohol. It was romantic for about 5 minutes, and then it was a nightmare. We were each other's worst enablers. We loved each other, but we were killing each other. And then we said enough. We entered rehab together in Tucson, Arizona. The early months were brutal. I remember one night I was sitting on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, convinced I couldn't do this. Barbara sat down beside me on that cold floor. She took my hand and said, "I'm here. I'm right here. We're doing this together." We sat like that most of the night. That was the moment I knew we were going to make it. A few years into sobriety, we decided to cook dinner together, pasta. Neither of us knew how to cook. The water boiled over, the sauce burned, the pasta came out gluey. Barbara looked at the disaster and said, with perfect deadpan, "We survived the 80s for this. We stood there laughing until we couldn't breathe, and then we ordered pizza. We were learning how to be ordinary people, and we were terrible at it, and we were so happy. She still brings me back to earth." Every night after a show, she's there. She doesn't ask how it was. She just says, "Hello, love," and hands me a cup of tea. We sit and talk about nothing, what she read, something funny with the road crew, what's blooming in the garden. She's the gardener. I'm the enthusiastic assistant. We meditate together every morning, 20 or 30 minutes of silence. It's been our practice since the early days of sobriety. Some of the most intimate moments of my marriage have happened in that silence. I remember an afternoon in the mid-90s. I was sitting in the living room, and suddenly I began to cry. Deep, racking sobs from somewhere I didn't know existed. Barbara came in from the kitchen. She just put her arms around me and let me cry. When I finally quieted, she said, "It's okay. It's been waiting a long time to come out. Let it." Nobody had ever told me it was okay to feel my feelings. She gave me the space to fall apart, and then she helped me put myself back together. When I think about Barbara, I think about the scent of her perfume in the morning. She's worn the same light fragrance for decades. It's the smell of the second chance. Every morning I think, we made it. We're still here. The next person, George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, the man who wrote Something and Here Comes the Sun. All of that is true, but that's not why I loved him. I loved him because he was the funniest person I've ever known and the most loyal. Once George loved you, he loved you forever. I first met him in Hamburg in 1960. I was drumming for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The Beatles were these scrappy kids. George was 17. After a show one night, he sat down next to me and said, completely without irony, "I like the way you play." You've got a feel. Just a kid, but he already had that directness. He looked you in the eye and said what he meant. After the Beatles broke up, I was in a bad way. My marriage crumbling. Drinking heavily. George called me and said, "Come down to the studio. I've got something." The place was full of musicians. Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, an army of players. George sat me behind the drum kit and said, "Play." I said, "But I don't know the songs." He said, "It doesn't matter, just play." I played all day. I realized later he didn't need me on those sessions. He called me because he knew I was lost. We'd walk his gardens at Friar Park for hours. George was an obsessive gardener. He'd point out flowers and trees, his voice animated with quiet enthusiasm. We wouldn't talk about the Beatles. We wouldn't talk about music. We'd just look at flowers. It was the most peaceful I ever felt. I remember during the Cloud 9 sessions, we got into this heated argument about the proper way to make tea. George insisted milk went in first. I was adamant milk went in last. Finally, Olivia came in and said, "You're both wrong." George looked at me, completely deadpan, and said, "She's only been in the family 10 years and already she thinks she knows tea." The whole studio dissolved. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. When John died, I was devastated. When I got back to England, George was the first person I called. He came over. We sat for hours. At one point he said, "He's not gone, you know, he's just not here anymore." The conviction in his voice, he believed it, and that helped me more than anything anyone else said. He got sick. I visited him as much as I could. The last time we were together, he was weak, but his spirit was intact. He told me, "I'm not afraid, it's just a body." I held his hand. He was the brave one right to the end. When he died, I was in Los Angeles. Olivia called. I was broken. There was a private memorial at Friar Park. The garden was in full autumn color, golden and red. It felt like he was still there among the flowers. I still talk to him sometimes. I'll be in the garden and say, "All right, George," and I can almost hear him. "All right, Rings." When I think about George, I think about the scent of roses, the old English roses he cultivated. I smell roses and I'm back in his garden, walking beside him in the golden afternoon light. The last person, Paul McCartney, Sir Paul McCartney, one half of the greatest songwriting partnership in history, the cheerful survivor, the eternal showman. But that's not why he's on this list. He's on this list because he's the only person alive who knows what it was like, the madness of Beatlemania, the specific, surreal, impossible experience. When I'm with Paul, I'm with someone who knows. I first met him in Hamburg, same as George. What I remember most is his energy. He was a force. He'd finish a set and immediately start working on a new song. There was a night the power went out in the club. Everyone else sat in the dark. Paul picked up an acoustic guitar and kept the audience entertained by candlelight. Nothing was going to stop him. When I officially joined the Beatles, Paul was the one who made the most effort to welcome me. He'd show me little things on the bass, ask my opinion on a song, just sit with me in the van. He made me feel like I belonged, but our relationship has had its difficulties. The years after the breakup were hard, the lawsuits, the bitterness. There were years when we didn't talk much, but after John died, that started to change. And after George died, we became the last two standing. We're closer now than we've ever been. A few years back, Paul invited me to his place in the Hamptons. Just the two of us, no entourages. We walked on the beach, we cooked meals together, we talked about our children, our gardens. One evening we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set. We'd been silent for a long time. Then Paul said, "You know, Rings, we did something, didn't we? We really did something." He wasn't talking about Grammys, he was talking about the music. I said, "Yeah, we did." He nodded. Two old friends sitting on a porch, saying, "Yeah, we did something. That's everything." There was a session in the 90s where Paul was producing a track for me. He was asking for take after take. After the 7th or 8th attempt, I took off my headphones and said, "Paul, why don't you just sing it yourself? You know you want to." He burst out laughing and said, "You're right, I do want to. But I'm not going to. It's your song. Sing it again." He pushes you because he believes you can do it. But he also knows when to laugh at himself. He has this habit when we say goodbye. He holds onto my hand a beat longer than necessary. Not a handshake, a clasp. It's like he's saying, "I'm still here. You're still here. We're still here." When I think about Paul, I think about the sound of a bass guitar being played in the next room. Not a performance, just the low melodic thrum of someone working out a line. It's the sound of work, the sound of Paul doing what Paul does. It's the sound of my whole life. When I think about Joe, I remember his honesty. When I think about George Martin, I remember his kindness. When I think about Barbara, I remember her courage. When I think about George Harrison, I remember his loyalty. And when I think about Paul, I remember his relentless, unstoppable aliveness. Music gave me a career, but people gave me a life. If I had one more afternoon with all of them, I don't think we'd talk about music. We'd probably talk about gardening, or make terrible pasta, or argue about how to brew a proper cup of tea. And after all these years, those are the people I still miss the most.